On the evening of June 9, 1995, a Little League baseball field in Alma, Arkansas glowed under tall stadium lights. The air was warm, heavy with the sounds of summer, children laughing, parents talking, the distant crack of a bat echoing across the field. It was the kind of night communities remember for years. Safe, familiar, ordinary. In the bleachers, a mother named 𝐂𝐇𝐬𝐿 sat beside her 6-year-old daughter, Morgan. Morgan was small for her age, quiet and gentle. She stayed close to her mother, laughing as she played with her shoelaces, unaware that this simple moment would soon become one her family would replay over and over again for decades. Because sometime between the end of that game and the walk back to the parking lot, Morgan 𝐂𝐞𝐬 vanished. No screams were heard. No struggle was seen. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. For years, investigators searched for answers across Arkansas and beyond, following thousands of leads that never quite reached the truth. But hidden inside video recordings from that very night were two details that would later take on extraordinary importance. One captured the final seconds before Morgan stepped away from her mother's side. The other showed a red pickup truck with a white camper sitting quietly in the background, a vehicle that would eventually become central to the investigation. Nearly 3 decades later, advances in forensic science would reveal that evidence connected to that truck matched Morgan's family line, leading authorities to identify a primary suspect in 2024. The clues had existed from the very beginning. What no one understood was what they were looking at. Alma, Arkansas was the kind of town where summer nights followed familiar patterns. The glow of stadium lights, the sound of children laughing behind chain-link fences, parents sitting shoulder to shoulder on aluminum bleachers while a Little League game stretched later than planned. It was routine, predictable, safe. On June 9, 1995, 𝐂𝐇𝐬𝐿 brought her 6-year-old daughter Morgan to one of those games. Morgan's younger siblings were staying with family that evening, which made this outing feel special, rare one-on-one time between mother and daughter. Nothing about the decision felt significant. It was simply a night together. Morgan stayed close to her mother at first. She was naturally shy, small for her age, more comfortable beside someone she trusted than running freely with other children. She played with her mother's shoelaces, laughing quietly, completely unaware that this moment would later become frozen in memory, replayed over and over again for years. Because sometimes the most painful memories are not dramatic. They are ordinary. Around them, the environment felt controlled. The baseball field was enclosed. Parents were everywhere. Children were visible behind the bleachers catching fireflies in the darkness, a harmless summer ritual that felt almost timeless. No alarms were raised, no danger was obvious. And yet, somewhere within that sense of safety, the conditions for something irreversible were already forming. How does a child disappear from a place filled with people, lights, and noise? The answer is uncomfortable because it challenges assumptions. Most people imagine abductions happening in isolated areas, empty streets, dark alleys, unknown environments. But cases like this often unfold in locations that feel protected precisely because they are familiar. Morgan eventually asked to join the other children playing behind the stands. From 𝐂𝐇𝐬𝐿's perspective, the decision seemed small. The distance was short. The area was visible. Other kids were there. Other parents were nearby. She could still see the direction Morgan was heading. There was no reason to believe those few minutes would become the most important minutes of her life. And this is where the timeline begins to narrow. Witnesses would later describe seeing a man near a vehicle in the parking area, a red pickup truck with a white camper shell, watching the children while they played. At the time, nothing about that observation seemed urgent enough to interrupt the evening. Adults standing near vehicles in parking lots was normal. People watching games from different angles was normal. Only later would those details become critical. What separates an ordinary memory from a clue? Often, the answer is time. In the moment, people record impressions, not evidence. A face without context. A vehicle without urgency. A moment without meaning. It is only after something goes wrong that those fragments are revisited and examined again. Investigators would eventually focus heavily on the description of that truck, red body, white camper shell, because multiple witnesses placed it near the area where Morgan was last seen. DNA evidence found in truck leads to suspect in Arkansas girl's 1995 abduction, CBS News 2024. The significance of that vehicle would not fully emerge until decades later, when advances in forensic science connected evidence associated with it to Morgan's family line, leading authorities to identify a primary suspect in 2024. But on that June night in 1995, none of that was known. What existed instead was a narrowing window of time, the space between when Morgan left her mother's side and when she was expected to return. Minutes. Just minutes. And within those minutes, something happened that would change hundreds of lives. Parents at the field would soon begin calling her name. The casual atmosphere would turn into confusion, then fear. Search efforts would begin almost immediately, but the realization would spread quickly. Morgan was not simply lost. She was gone. If multiple people were present, why didn't anyone see exactly what happened? That question would haunt investigators for years. Because somewhere between the bleachers and the parking lot, a child disappeared without a clear witness, without a clear timeline, and without immediate answers. And what makes this moment even more chilling is what investigators would later learn about events that may have occurred earlier that same day. Events that, if connected, suggest the danger did not begin at the baseball field at all. It may have started hours before anyone arrived. By the time darkness settled over Alma, the Little League field felt less like an organized event and more like a drifting crowd held together by habit. Stadium lights buzzed overhead, bright enough to make the infield glow, but not bright enough to erase the shadows beyond the bleachers. The game had run late. Parents leaned forward, tired but focused on the final innings. Children, restless and bored, began slipping away from their seats and toward the fence line, chasing fireflies, running in small circles, laughing in that carefree way only kids can. Morgan Nick stayed close to her mother, Colleen, for most of the night. She wasn't the kind of child who sprinted off at the first chance. She lingered beside the person who made her feel safe. She played with shoelaces, giggling, repeating small games that meant nothing to anyone else, but meant everything later. Colleen watched the field and watched Morgan at the same time, the way parents do without realizing they're doing it. Then 2 children approached Morgan and asked her to come play. Morgan hesitated. She didn't immediately jump up. She stayed seated, glancing at her mother, as if checking whether the world outside the bleachers was truly allowed. For a moment, she stayed right where she was. For Colleen, that hesitation felt reassuring. It was proof of what she already believed, that Morgan would not wander far on her own. But the late hours change the rules of a place. The longer a night goes on without problems, the more people relax. The more parents look away. The more safe becomes an assumption instead of a decision. At what point does a familiar place quietly become the perfect place to hide danger? Around 10:30 p.m., the same children returned. This time, they didn't just ask Morgan to come play, they asked her to catch fireflies. It sounded harmless, almost sweet, a childhood ritual. Morgan turned to her mother and asked permission. Colleen paused. It wasn't panic. It wasn't a clear warning. It was something softer and harder to explain, a brief resistance, a feeling that said not tonight. But along with that instinct came another voice, the voice of being told you're too protective, too cautious, too controlling. The pressure of being reasonable. The pressure of not embarrassing yourself in front of other parents. The pressure of believing nothing bad happens in places like this. Other parents were nearby. Kids had been playing there all evening. The fences made the area feel visible, manageable. So Colleen said yes. Morgan's happiness was instant. She hugged her mother tightly, kissed her cheek, and climbed down from the bleachers to follow the other children toward the darker edge of the field, toward the parking lot beyond the fence line. That hug would become unbearable to remember, because it was the last time Colleen ever held her daughter. Why do the smallest yes decisions sometimes carry the weight of a lifetime? From her seat, Colleen could still see the direction Morgan went. The distance felt short. The time felt small. Nothing about the moment suggested urgency. Colleen turned her attention back to the game, expecting Morgan to return in minutes. In cases like this, the most terrifying part is not what people saw, it's what they didn't. A crowded place creates noise and movement. A child can be guided away without anyone realizing a boundary has been crossed. And later, when witnesses try to explain what they remember, they are often describing pieces of a puzzle they didn't know they were collecting. Some people would later recall a man near the parking area watching children from around a vehicle. They would recall a red pickup truck with a white camper shell. At the time, it didn't trigger immediate alarm because adults near vehicles is common and watching kids at a public game can look like nothing. But the night was quietly narrowing into a window, measured in minutes. And when the game finally ended, the entire environment shifted at once. Parents stood up, chairs scraped, people gathered bags and coolers, children ran back toward their families. Colleen looked for Morgan. The other two kids returned. Morgan didn't. At first, the mind refuses to accept it. Maybe she's behind them. Maybe she stopped to tie her shoe. Maybe she's just out of sight for a second. Then seconds turn into something sharper. Colleen climbed down and moved toward the area behind the bleachers. She called Morgan's name. She scanned between vehicles under harsh light, across the gravel and shadows. Her voice tightened, her steps quickened. The calm of the game collapsed into panic. Morgan was nowhere. And in that moment, a question forms that never lets go. If someone took her from that field, how fast could they leave before anyone even realized she was missing? Arkansas police named suspect in 1995 disappearance of Morgan 𝐸𝐞𝐬 after new DNA evidence. AP News, Doct 1, 2024. As the search began exploding outward, investigators would soon learn something even more chilling. There were reports from earlier that same day. Encounters involving a red truck that suggested the danger may have been circling Alma long before the first pitch was thrown. So what happened hours earlier that almost no one connected to Morgan until decades later? In the minutes after Morgan 𝐸𝐞𝐬 failed to return, the ball field stopped feeling like a community gathering and started feeling like a sealed crime scene that no one knew how to seal yet. Parents moved in widening circles, calling her name, checking between cars, scanning the fence line and the darker corners beyond the lights. Some searched calmly at first, because the human mind clings to ordinary explanations. A child got distracted. A child wandered to another group. A child is hiding, playing. But the longer Morgan stayed missing, the harder it became to hold on to those comforting possibilities. Colleen's fear rose fast, not as a single wave, but as a series of realizations. Morgan wouldn't leave the area alone. Morgan wouldn't ignore her voice. Morgan wouldn't stay hidden while her mother called. When the first officers arrived, they stepped into a scene that was already heavy with panic. Dozens of people, conflicting directions, everyone pointing at the same places: parking lot, fence, the spaces where children had been playing. And that's when witness memory begins to matter. Because in the earliest stage of a case like this, investigators don't have a suspect. They don't even have proof it was an abduction. What they have are fragments, small observations that didn't feel important at the time, but suddenly become the center of everything. People started mentioning a man, not a name, not a clear identity, just a presence. Someone who seemed out of place, someone watching children too closely, someone lingering near a vehicle. And the vehicle description repeated with frightening consistency: a red pickup truck with a camper shell. That detail became the first hard shape in the fog. When a crowd remembers the same vehicle, is it a clue or a coincidence that feels like a clue? Police began doing what they had to do, fast. They tried to identify everyone who had been at the game. They tried to determine which vehicles belonged to parents and which did not. They gathered descriptions and tried to standardize them, because every witness sees the same object differently under stress. One person remembers boxy, another remembers older, another remembers like a Ford. Someone else insists it looked like a Chevy. In a case measured in minutes, those differences can cost hours. Meanwhile, the community's fears spread beyond the ball field. Within hours, Morgan's face was being shared, her name moving from neighborhood conversation to statewide attention. The more the story traveled, the more tips poured in. And the more tips poured in, the more investigators faced a second problem. Too much information can bury the one piece that matters. How do you find the single real lead inside a flood of well-meaning noise? As days turned into weeks, one detail remained stubbornly present in the case: the red pickup truck with the camper shell. Investigators and media repeatedly returned to it, because it was the most concrete element witnesses could agree on. Years later, investigators and journalists would describe the truck as one of the most important early clues, a vehicle reported near the ball field at the time Morgan disappeared, and associated with reports of a man approaching children. And then the case gained another disturbing layer. 2 months after Morgan vanished, an 11-year-old girl reported an attempted abduction involving a man in a red pickup truck resembling the one connected to Morgan's disappearance. It didn't prove guilt. It didn't solve the case. But it gave investigators something they didn't have in the beginning: a name that could be investigated, a pattern that could be questioned, a suspect who fit the shape of the story. What if the same person didn't just appear that night, but had been circling opportunities long before anyone noticed? For Colleen, time became something cruel. The world kept moving, days turning into weeks, weeks into years, while she remained locked in the same moment. Morgan stepping away, the fireflies in the dark, and the silence that followed. And that is where the footage becomes something more than a recording. It becomes a timeline. Because when investigators re-examine cases decades later, they don't just look for new suspects. They look for the same old details that people once dismissed, and they ask whether those details finally mean something different. Still Missing Morgan digs into 1995 kidnapping of 6-year-old with new key evidence. ABC News, Deb 27, 2023. That report explains how investigators focused on the red pickup truck with a camper near the ball field, and how the attempted abduction 2 months later tied investigators' attention to Billy Jack Links. But in 1995, the case still had one brutal problem. Morgan vanished during a narrow window of time, and the only people closest to her in that window were children. And what those children would say next would shape the entire investigation. So, what exactly did they see near the truck? And what happened in the final seconds before Morgan was gone? When the first shock settled into something sharper, investigators did what every missing child case demands in its earliest hours. They tried to reconstruct the final minutes with absolute precision. Not the hours, not the day, the minutes. And the closest people to Morgan during those minutes were not adults. They were children. 2 kids, older than Morgan, but still young enough to see the world in flashes instead of full explanations, had been with her near the edge of the field. They described the same simple plan, catching fireflies in the warm dark behind the bleachers. It was the kind of game children play without thinking, the kind that feels safe because it's happening while parents are nearby and lights are still on. But then they mentioned something that changed the temperature of the entire case. A man. Not a passing stranger walking through, not a father looking for his kid. A man who seemed to be watching them, lingered near a truck, stayed close enough to be noticed, but not close enough to start a scene. And that detail matters. Because predators don't want noise. They want distance disguised as normal. The children said the man appeared near a vehicle in the parking area, the door open, his attention directed toward them while they played near a sand pile. In the moment it felt strange, but it didn't feel like something a child could name as danger. Adults in public places can look like scenery. How do children recognize a threat when they don't yet have the words for one? According to accounts repeated in later reporting, Morgan was last seen near a vehicle while she and the other children were tapping sand from their shoes. The children were a short distance apart, close enough to feel together, far enough for a single moment of separation to become permanent. That's what makes this part of the timeline so brutal. There's no dramatic final image, no scream, no clear struggle. Just a child finishing a small task, emptying sand, standing up, moving one step and slipping out of the visible world. Morgan's last confirmed sighting happens during a routine child's motion, tapping sand from her shoes right beside the parking area. Investigators pressed for details. Was the man talking? Was he smiling? Did he call out? Did he touch her? The children didn't describe a clear confrontation. What they described was presence. Watching. A feeling of wrongness without proof. And when Colleen reached the area moments later, the parking lot had already begun to thin. Most people were leaving. The end of a game empties a place fast. Cars start, doors slam, gravel crunches beneath tires, headlights sweep across faces, and the crowd dissolves. That creates a horrifying possibility. If someone wanted to remove a child quickly, the end of the game might have been the perfect cover. In a crowded place, what's easier to hide, stillness or movement? That question becomes central here because Morgan's disappearance wasn't a long-distance mystery at first. It was a near-distance one. She was close. She should have been visible. She should have been seconds away. But the environment had too many exits. The edge of the lot, the road, the darkness beyond the lights. And there's another reason the children's account became so important. They gave investigators a direction. Not a certainty, but a focus toward a particular kind of truck and a particular kind of man. Over time, that description would echo through the case: a red pickup with a white camper shell, and a bearded man seen near where Morgan was last observed. Decades later, the same core details, fireflies, the parking area, the red pickup, would appear again when the case saw a major breakthrough. A girl, 6, was brazenly abducted from a Little League game. Her family waited 30 years for suspect's arrest. People, Nov 9, 2024. That report describes how Morgan was last seen dumping sand from her shoes near a car, and how a red pickup driven by a bearded man was spotted around the same time, details that remained central as investigators pursued answers. For decades. Still, the harsh truth remains: the children's memories could point toward the scene, but they couldn't provide a full explanation of what happened in the final seconds. And for Colleen, that uncertainty became its own kind of prison. Because if you cannot picture the moment your child was taken, your mind tries to create it, again and again, searching for the version where you catch it in time. What is worse, knowing exactly what happened, or never knowing the exact moment it happened? But investigators began hearing something else, something that suggested the danger may not have started at 10:30 p.m. or 10:40 p.m. It may have been present earlier. There were reports of a red truck that day in Alma, reports of a man approaching girls, moments that sounded isolated until they were placed side by side. And if those reports were true, then the baseball field wasn't the beginning of the threat. It was the destination. So what happened earlier that day, and why did it take years for investigators to connect those encounters into a single path? By midnight, the Little League field no longer felt like a ballpark. It felt like a perimeter that had failed. As searchlights swept across grass and gravel, one reality hardened into place: Morgan Nick had not simply wandered off. Too many people had looked. Too many names had been called. Too many minutes had passed without an answer. So investigators narrowed the case the only way they could, by rebuilding it from the fragments people remembered. A man near the children. A vehicle near the parking area. And the description that kept returning, again and again from different mouths and different angles: a red pickup truck with a white camper shell. In the first hours, a vehicle description feels like hope. Something concrete. Something you can chase. But in the first days, that same description can become a storm. Because a red pickup isn't rare. A camper shell isn't rare. The more the detail spreads through news broadcasts and conversations, the more the public starts seeing it everywhere. Drivers were questioned. People were stopped. Tips poured in. Some were sincere. Some were guesses. Some were just fear disguised as certainty. And for investigators, the nightmare wasn't a lack of information. It was too much of it. How do you hold on to the one true lead when you're buried under 1,000 almost leads? They began doing what cases like this demand, identifying who belonged at that game and who didn't. Parents, coaches, families, regular faces, people who could be accounted for. And then, everything left over became suspicious by default. But suspicion is not evidence, it's only a direction. Witnesses describe the driver as a white male, scruffy facial hair, shirtless, details that can blur under stadium lights, under shock, under time. Investigators worked to build the best possible picture of what people thought they saw, knowing that a composite sketch is never a photograph, it's a translation of memory. And memory is fragile. That's what made the truck detail so powerful. It was easier to agree on a vehicle than a face. Even so, the truck itself became a problem. Some people insisted it looked like one make, others swore it was another. One witness might describe a rounded body, another might remember sharp corners. The same red paint can look different under yellow lights. The same camper shell can look like a different model from 10 feet away. The case began to balance on a single, frightening possibility. They might be searching for the wrong truck. If one detail is slightly wrong, how far can an entire investigation drift off course? And while law enforcement searched outward, 𝐂𝐬𝐿 lived inside a different kind of search, one that never paused. She replayed the night in her mind, not like a memory, but like a question with no ending. The fireflies, the fence line, the distance between I can still see her and she's gone. Every parent understands the impulse to rewind time, but in reality, all you can do is move forward, carrying the weight. Days passed. Posters went up. Names were called into the dark. The community held on to the idea that a child could still be found quickly, because the alternative was unbearable. And then the years began arriving. The case never truly vanished from Arkansas, but as time stretched on, it became the kind of story people whispered about with lowered voices. A reminder that the unthinkable doesn't need isolation, it only needs an opening. Decades later, investigators would return to that opening, back to the truck, back to the evidence, back to the question of whether the earliest clues were pointing at the right person all along. In September and October of 2024, reporting confirmed that advanced DNA testing on material recovered from a pickup truck once owned by Billy Jack Lynx strongly indicated Morgan had been inside that vehicle, leading authorities to name him as the suspect, while also confirming the investigation was still active and still seeking answers about what happened next. What does it mean when a case finally names a suspect, but the child is still missing? DNA links Morgan 𝐸 to truck, suspect named in her 1995 kidnapping, 𝐂𝐇𝐬 𝐶EP30, Oct. 1, 2024. Even with that breakthrough, the story still leaves a shadow behind it. Because identifying a suspect doesn't answer the hardest questions. It only sharpens them. And those questions were about to grow darker. Because not long after Morgan disappeared, another child would face a terrifying encounter nearby, involving a man in a red pickup truck. So what happened 2 months later that made investigators look back at this case with fresh dread? In the weeks after Morgan 𝐸 vanished, the search didn't feel like an investigation. It felt like a race against time that no one could win. Posters went up, tips poured in. Names of strangers were written down and checked off. And still, the center of the case remained the same empty space, a 6-year-old child who never made it back to her mother. Then, 2 months later, something happened that changed the tone of everything. Not a rumor, not a sighting, an incident. In late August 1995, an 11-year-old girl stood outside a Sonic in Arkansas when a man approached in a red pickup truck. His behavior wasn't subtle. He tried to separate her from others. He offered money. He pushed closer. And when the situation turned against him, he sped off, reckless enough that he crashed and drew attention that couldn't be ignored. Witnesses got the license plate. Police identified the driver as Billy Jack Lynx. And suddenly, the case that had been floating in uncertainty snapped toward a single name. Lynx was not a distant possibility. He lived close enough to matter. He drove the kind of vehicle witnesses had been describing. And the timing, 2 months after Morgan's disappearance, felt too sharp to ignore. Investigators questioned him. They looked at what he drove. They looked at what he carried. They tried to determine whether this was the same danger that had been present at the ball field. What are the odds that a man connected to a red pickup shows up in another attempted abduction so soon after Morgan vanished? For families, moments like this are both hope and horror. Hope, because a name can be chased. Horror, because a name means the threat was real all along. Lynx was arrested and prosecuted for the Sonic incident. He would later die in prison. But the Morgan-Nick case didn't close with him. Not then. Because in the 1990s, investigators were limited by what science could prove. A suspect could draw attention, even suspicion, and still remain legally untouchable without evidence that held up under scrutiny. Over time, pieces of evidence were collected, stored, and filed away, waiting for technology that didn't exist yet. And the case fell into the kind of silence that feels like a second disappearance. Years passed with no arrest, no recovery, no moment where the world could finally say, "Here's what happened." For 𝐂𝐬𝐿, the passage of time wasn't healing, it was distortion. People forget details, memories soften, witnesses move away. And a case can slowly turn from a living emergency into a file people only reopen when there's a new reason. Still, one thing refused to die: the truck. That red pickup with the white camper shell stayed inside the story like a shadow that never left the frame. People argued about the make, people debated the shape. But the idea remained. A vehicle like that was there, close to Morgan, at the moment she disappeared. And decades later, investigators would go back to that same thread with fresh tools and fresh determination. When time passes, does a case grow colder? Or does the evidence simply wait for the right moment to speak? By the 2020s, forensic science had advanced to the point where even degraded samples, hair, trace material, fragments once considered useless, could sometimes produce answers. Investigators revisited the old assumptions, the old witness statements, the old focus on the truck. And the result was a breakthrough that reframed everything. In 2024, official updates confirmed that DNA testing on hair associated with a truck once owned by Lynx strongly indicated that Morgan had been inside it, linking the suspect to the disappearance in a way that earlier decades could not. The announcement did not end the case, because Morgan is still missing. But it finally made one thing clear: the earliest suspicion had not been meaningless. If that truck is truly part of the answer, what does it say about how close the truth was from the beginning? Breaking. Suspect ID'd in Morgan-Nick case, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 2024. Even after that kind of confirmation, one question refuses to fade. Where is Morgan? Because identifying a suspect answers only the first part of a disappearance. The second part, the part that matters most to families, is what happened after the moment the child was taken. And that is where this story turns into something even more unsettling. Decades of waiting, thousands of tips, and a mother who refused to let the case become history. So what kept this investigation alive for nearly 30 years, and what finally forced detectives to start over with new eyes? The days after Morgan-Nick disappeared were filled with movement, search lines, flashlights, volunteers, phone calls, and roads checked again and again. But as weeks turned into months, something changed in a way no family is ever prepared for. The world moved on. The headlines slowed. The crowds thinned. Tips still came in, but the urgency of the first nights faded into a quieter kind of waiting. And for 𝐂𝐬𝐿, that waiting wasn't passive. It was constant. It was exhausting. It was the kind of living that feels like holding your breath for years. Inside her home, Morgan's absence didn't become normal. It became louder with time. Holidays arrived without her. Birthdays passed with only an age progression photo to imagine what she might look like. People would ask the same question with softened voices. Do you think she's still alive? As if hope itself had an expiration date. When a child goes missing, what happens to the parent who refuses to accept time as an answer? 𝐂𝐬𝐿 could have disappeared into grief. Many people do. But she did something else. She turned the pain into a mission. Because doing nothing felt like losing Morgan a second time. She met other families living the same nightmare. She listened to the stories nobody wants to hear. Children taken, cases stalled, evidence misplaced, leads collapsing into silence. And the more she saw, the more she understood a brutal truth. Morgan's case wasn't the only one. It was one of many. So, she fought in the only way she knew how, by keeping Morgan visible, by pushing child safety into public conversation, by making sure law enforcement training and community awareness didn't depend on whether a case was new enough to trend. And over time, that fight became an organization. The 𝐑𝐞𝐬𝐬 Foundation grew out of a mother's refusal to stop searching. It became a place where other families could find support, resources, and guidance. Because when your child is missing, the world doesn't hand you a manual. It hands you silence. If the system wasn't built to carry families through years of waiting, who was? In this story, every claim that matters will be tied to a credible record, because the difference between belief and proof is where the truth survives. Years passed. Investigators changed. Technology evolved. Leads that once went nowhere were revisited with fresh tools. But the most important force staying constant was Colleen herself, showing up, speaking out, keeping the case from becoming a forgotten folder. Then, decades later, a new kind of breakthrough arrived, not because the story changed, but because science did. Modern genetic testing made it possible to analyze evidence in ways that simply weren't available in the 1990s. A single hair, a trace left behind, something once too weak to speak, suddenly capable of pointing to a family line. Colleen followed those developments closely, because hope for families often arrives through the smallest openings. And as new testing reshaped cold cases across the country, it also reshaped the question hanging over Morgan's case. Not, did someone take her? But can we finally prove who? How many cold cases are only waiting for the right decade to become solvable? A major public update arrived in 2025 describing how Colleen's decades-long fight kept Morgan's case alive, while also acknowledging the breakthrough that came with advanced DNA testing and the identification of a suspect, without pretending that the story was finished. 30 years missing, 𝐑𝐞𝐬𝐬's legacy lives on. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, June 5, 2025. Even with a suspect named, Morgan is still missing. And that fact changes the meaning of everything. A suspect can die. Evidence can degrade. Time can steal opportunities. But the absence remains, an unanswered space no press conference can fill. And yet, something else happened behind the scenes, something that families rarely get to witness. In 2019, investigators began looking at Morgan's case with fresh eyes again. Not as a historical tragedy, but as an active investigation. They returned to witness statements. They returned to the truck sightings. They returned to details that once seemed too small to matter. Because in long, unsolved cases, the truth often isn't found by discovering something brand new. It's found by realizing something old was misunderstood. What if the key to everything wasn't missing at all? What if it was sitting in the file the entire time? And that is where the story shifts into its most unsettling phase. Because once detectives started mapping the sightings and timelines again, the pattern began to emerge like a path. A path that didn't wander randomly through Alma. A path that seemed to lead somewhere on purpose. So when investigators rebuilt the day from the ground up, what did the map of sightings reveal, and where did it point? By 2019, 𝐑𝐞𝐬𝐬 had been missing for nearly a quarter of a century. A case like that can easily become a museum piece, boxes on shelves, names on paper, memories fading in the corners of a file. But in Alma, the case did not disappear into storage. It stayed alive because someone kept returning to the same question again and again. What if the answer was missed, not lost? A new lead investigator approached the case like a reconstruction, not a recap. Instead of starting with theories, he started with geography, reports, sightings, times. And he did something simple that changed the shape of the story. He placed every reported encounter with the red pickup truck onto a map. What appeared at first like scattered statements began to form a direction. Not random, a path. Locations across Alma where witnesses had described a red pickup with a white camper shell, near kids, near roads, near places where someone could pause without attracting attention, linked together as if the vehicle had been moving with purpose. Some reports involved teenagers approached by a driver offering a ride. Others involved children frightened by a truck lingering too long. Another involved a group who believed they saw a man with a child in the front seat shortly after the abduction. One by one, those points led toward the same place, the ball field. When sightings connect like a trail, Is it coincidence or intent? This was the moment the case stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like a rout, and it forced a hard truth. The danger may not have begun when Morgan stepped away from her mother. The danger may have been present in Alma for hours, watching for the easiest opening. A ground rule before we go further: we follow what can be verified, and we mark what remains unanswered, because families deserve truth, not rumors. With that mindset, investigators returned to the physical evidence and the suspect vehicle, because even the strongest map means nothing if it can't be anchored to something real. The red pickup had been a haunting symbol for decades. Now it became the center of a renewed effort. Eventually, investigators located the truck that had once belonged to Billy Jack Lynx. The vehicle had changed hands over the years, passing through time the way objects do, quietly, without carrying the weight of what they once held. But when the truck was processed again, the search wasn't for fingerprints or obvious signs of a struggle. It was for what time usually destroys: trace evidence. A single hair. Something small enough to be dismissed in 1995, but powerful enough to speak in the modern era. The evidence was sent for advanced testing, and what came back did not provide a neat ending. It provided something far more unsettling. A connection, not to a stranger, to Morgan's family line. That meant the most frightening implication wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't based only on witness descriptions and old memories. It was physical, something that had been inside that vehicle, tied to the people who had lost Morgan. What does it do to a case when science finally confirms what instincts suspected for decades? In October 2024, authorities publicly identified Billy Jack Lynx as the suspect in Morgan 𝐂𝐞𝐬 abduction based on that modern forensic work. It was the closest thing the case had ever had to a definitive answer about who took her. But it also reopened the hardest question, the one no press conference can resolve. Where is Morgan? Because time changes everything except absence. A suspect can die. A truck can be sold. Evidence can degrade. But a child who never came home remains a wound that does not close. And for Colleen 𝐂𝐞𝐬, the announcement did not feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that her instincts that night had mattered. Confirmation that the fear she lived with was not imagined. Confirmation that the truth had been orbiting the case for years. Yet even now, the story remains unfinished. Investigators still have to answer what happened after Morgan was taken. Whether anyone helped. Whether evidence was lost to weather, distance, or time. Whether the route on that map leads to a place the world has never searched. If the case finally has a name, why does it still feel like the most important part is missing? Cutting-edge DNA testing used in Morgan 𝐂𝐞𝐬 cold case breakthrough, 𝐂𝐇𝐏 𝐋𝐢𝐬 2024. The truth is, this case didn't change overnight. It changed because someone refused to let time decide what mattered, and because science finally caught up to a piece of evidence that had been waiting for decades. And now, the story reaches the most fragile point, where answers exist, but closure does not. So what do we do with a breakthrough that points to a suspect, when Morgan still hasn't been found? The truth is, naming a suspect is not the same thing as bringing a child home. In October 2024, investigators publicly identified Billy Jack Lynx as the suspect in Morgan 𝐂𝐞𝐬 abduction based on modern DNA work tied to evidence connected to his truck. But even with that announcement, the most important question remains unanswered. Where is Morgan? And that question is the reason this case still matters. Because a suspect can be identified while a family still lives inside the same missing space. Colleen 𝐂𝐞𝐬 has spent nearly 3 decades refusing to let that space become silence, turning grief into action, keeping Morgan's name visible when the world was ready to forget. Before you leave, hear this clearly. This case has some extensive research and very time talking, so we could need to cover every angle of the case. If you're interested to read the complete investigation, then I will add resource links in the description. You can read from there. If you want more investigations like this, told with evidence, not rumors, subscribe to Hidden 𝐬𝐬 right now. Don't just watch. Join the search. Because the more people who remember these names, the harder it becomes for the truth to stay buried.